And let's bring in now a guest who's been tracking all this by the numbers, and it comes to us on a day where the Ontario government released potential range of numbers when it comes to COVID deaths. Professor and epidemiologist from the University of Ottawa, Raywat Deonandan joins us now on 680 CJOB. Raywat, thank you so very much for joining us. First, the projections from the Ontario government here. On the low side, what was it, 3,000, upwards of 15,000 deaths could potentially occur here. I understand that they've released these numbers in the United States. How accurate is that?
I mean, accuracy is a difficult word to apply here. Models are, by their very nature, imprecise. And there's an art that goes into it as much as there is a science. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to describe the present, and I can throw in all sorts of variables into a mathematical model to describe what's going on right now really well. But the more precise I get about the present, the more imprecise I get about the future. And the more into the future we get, the more imprecise it becomes. But to answer your question, how accurate is it? I think it's probably a good ballpark. I mean, it's a wide range, 3,000 to 10,000. That's the same projection we see around California, which has a similar size of Canada and maybe a similar demographic to Ontario and other American states. So I think we're in the right ballpark, 3 to 10,000. The low end being 3,000. If I had to make a guess, I would anticipate probably 5,000.
And that's Ontario. Our premier, Brian Pallister, was asked the question. He doesn't want to go there, but having said that, they'll likely release some of those numbers as early as next week as far as projections are concerned. And again, you're an epidemiologist, but from an ethical standpoint, does it work to release those numbers?
Yeah, and here's why. We live in a time where there is a fundamental distrust of authority for a variety of reasons. And asking people to stay in has worked to some extent, and having them trust our best judgment. But now we're at the stage where we need to convince people of why we have made this recommendation. And being transparent with our thought process is part of that ordeal. We've learned through previous public health engagements, whether it's through our smoking campaign or other kinds of campaigns to encourage people to do healthy behaviors, that it doesn't help if we are deceitful or if we are seen to be obfuscating the truth. The more transparency, the better. In particular, transparency about our limitations in our ability to see the future, because there are some serious limitations here. For the purposes of health systems planning, we have to consider the worst case scenario, because that is unacceptable.
I think a lot of people would say that the media is trying to sensationalize this in terms of the death tolls or potential death tolls, but it really comes down to, yes, convincing people that they need to continue with these measures, but also, as you say, so that down the road, when we're looking at the numbers, we can say, this is how much we need to have stockpiled and at the ready, so we don't ever find ourselves in a situation where we're paying 2 or 3 times what these goods are worth on the market to get our hospitals and our frontline staff stocked up.
That's exactly right. Models are good for a lot of reasons, 2 in particular. One, you can model the present to talk about the ways in which things are related to each other. But in this case, we're modeling the future to be able to plan for the worst. It's important to note that we've seen how other countries have dealt with this, and they have released their models and their experiences. And countries like Iceland, for example, publishes on their website a very detailed epidemiological model of their COVID epidemic, and their cases are tracking pretty precisely on the curve that they projected. So based upon that experience, there's an expectation that ours is probably going to be a little bit accurate. So this is not sensationalized to any extent. As long as we're providing the error bars, the uncertainty, then people need to understand that low estimate in Ontario of 3,000 deaths, that's a genuine basement estimate. And it'll probably be higher than that.
Can we know down the road in terms of when you're looking at the numbers and seeing the data come in, and you certainly don't have them from all of the provinces yet, where we can anticipate that these peaks will be? I think that's what everybody ultimately wants to know is, are we at the peak now? Is the peak going to be in 4 to 6 weeks? Where are we in all of this? Or do we even know?
That's right. And I'm disappointed that the Ontario data dump today did not include a model of the peak. One of their slides that they gave showed the ICU growth of when they expect our ICU beds to be saturated. And that gives a sense of when we think the worst will be for our hospitalized population sometime in late April. Other countries and provinces and states have been a bit more transparent in their expectations of when the wave will peak. And the consensus seems to be in North America sometime in April. If all goes well, if everyone does their part, we will see the curve start to bend. Keep in mind that we accelerated to the peak quickly. We're going to decline slowly. And hopefully we'll get this thing under control in a matter of months.
And you don't want that second wave to come either. So, that's the question I'm getting asked. When do you think that this is going to peak and we can go back all to normal again? And I'm telling folks that we're not in this for weeks, it's months.
It's months, exactly. And there is a new normal. This right now will not be the new normal, this lockdown scenario. But the new normal will be some degree of isolation. So Gates Foundation has a prediction that most of the cases will have been experienced if with appropriate lockdown by the end of June or so, and a second wave expected sometime later in the year, probably in the fall. But we can delay or even avoid that second wave if at the end of this current wave, when we return to society, we do the appropriate public health investments, like expanded, intense, frequent testing and a lot of contact tracing, which is why I'm pleased that the Prime Minister announced that there's an army of contact tracers about to be deployed. We're recruiting medical students, and there's a call on by the federal government for people to volunteer around the country if they have any sort of epidemiological expertise to be contact tracers. That's the kind of low-tech, available technology we can deploy now when the current wave is over to prevent the second wave from being intense.
What's one good thing that governments have been doing from your standpoint in looking at the numbers, and what's one thing that you wish they could change right now to make better so that we can have better, more accurate information?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think governments, it's really easy to point fingers, and I decided I'm not going to be critical of people's decision making. I think in Canada, our leaders are doing the best that they can, given the circumstance. And in hindsight, I wish they had done some things differently, like restrict travel earlier, like close the borders earlier, like compel people to stay home earlier. At this point, what is needed is to convince the outliers, the people who are still not taking it seriously, that they need to stay home. Every time someone is caught having a house party or something, it extends our stay at home longer than it needs to be. We need to go back to work. We need for this thing to end soon so that we can rescue our economy and a bunch of jobs. And that is best done if everyone gets on board and does their part, which means isolating and distancing to slow the rate of new case development. It's a simple message. And somehow we've not done a good job of selling that message to all the different kinds of people who need to hear it.
You just did. Professor, appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Raywat Deonandan joining us live on 680 CJOB.